Welcome to Living Yoga. My name is Darren Main, and in this podcast, I like to talk about all things having to do with yoga and wellness and spirituality and just making yourself a better person. And I love to dive into the topics that you don't hear too much about, and today is no exception. I have Matthew Remski on. He is very well known for his Conspirituality Podcast that he co-hosts. And doing investigative journalism, a lot into sort of the new age spirituality, holistic health movement, and where we may have gone a little off course. And he has a new book out. It's called Surviving Modern Yoga, which does sort of a deep dive into some of the toxic elements of the yoga community in general, and specifically into Pattabhi Jois, the founder of Ashtanga Yoga or Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, the primary series that many people practice. So we're going to be talking about all of that. If you would like to connect with Matthew, I'll put links to his website and social media in the show notes, as well as his book. And his website, if you want to just type it in, is matthewremski.com. I will also put links to all of my resources. You can follow, subscribe this podcast. You can follow me on social and get information about all my other work as well. All that said, Matthew, welcome. I am so thrilled to have you here, and you and I have a history together.
We do, Darren.
I don't know if you want to admit to that or not, but
for sure, because you're a very important person in my life. Actually, when I had sort of just begun my recovery arc from being involved in two different high demand groups, the yoga world and especially its gig work economy was exploding. And I think you were one of the very entrepreneurial early adopters of the sort of compressed yoga teacher training model, and you were leading a particular event, like a 30-day thing in Costa Rica that lined up with my schedule. I had no idea who you were, but I looked into some of your materials beforehand. But I really just wanted to sort of both take some time for myself, but also gain a skill for this new burgeoning industry. And I wound up in your training, and it was a really wonderful experience. I think you were frank, you were kind, you were gentle, you're queer positive. I mean, like you sort of checked all of the boxes for the kind of educational experience that I needed at that time, and that was really great.
Well, thank you. That means a lot coming from you, but also coming from the version of you that I'm chatting with today that has been pretty fearless at looking at what's right about the sort of yoga health movement, but also what's wrong. And I won't go deep into my history, but having seen some of the wreckage of some of the toxic elements of the yoga community, I think we line up on the same page, and I'm really, really proud of the work you're doing. Let's dive right in. I want to say this up front. I know that many of you watching have benefited greatly from yoga in general and from various prominent teachers that have delivered a lot of wisdom, a lot of insight, a lot of inspiration around yoga. And some of you have been harmed. So some of what we're going to talk about could be triggering. Some of it could be like, how dare you say that about this person I care about? So buckle in and feel free to share your comments and stories. I'm sure there are many. Matthew, you wrote a book, Surviving Modern Yoga, and also this dovetails with the Conspirituality Podcast you do, which is fantastic. You sort of focused in on Pattabhi Jois, and maybe you could say who he is in case people aren't familiar with him by name, and why you chose him, because there's so many to pick from.
There are so many to pick from. So I'll get to why that became the focus in a bit. That was really almost by a series of coincidences. But Pattabhi Jois was one of the premier kind of first generation modern postural yoga entrepreneurs coming out of India in the mid 20th century. He was born in 1915. He's educated by Tirumalai Krishnamacharya in the Mysore Yoga Shala that was sponsored by the Maharaja of Wadior at the time. So this is the school that produced BKS Iyengar as well, and many of the sort of therapeutic, or I would say near therapeutic principles that go on to be found in the work of people like TKV Desikachar. Now, Tirumalai Krishnamacharya was quite a battle axe of a teacher, not uncommon for the day. He ruled with an iron fist. BKS Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois both recall as boys being beaten while learning their postures. And I think what's significant there is not just a kind of nostalgic reflection on the state of education in India at the time, and of course throughout the rest of the world. But also what becomes very important is that the correction of the boys in that school was intrinsic with corporal punishment. Getting the postures right was subject to, reward or physical punishment. And that sort of makes its way into the sort of subtext of how people get adjusted throughout the modern yoga world going forward. And when he gains prominence amongst American spiritual seekers in the late 70s, who eventually start inviting him to the States and then to other places around the world, he delivers a kind of extraordinarily intense, fluid, I would call it like a spiritual gymnastics that his followers, because of its physical intensity and precisely because of his physical interventions, because of his adjustments, think that they are being, and they feel, I don't want to question that actually, they say that they are being reorganized from the inside out. They say that they are being transformed. One of his students famously said, being adjusted by Pattabhi Jois was like undergoing a birth process. Now, what becomes strange is that way of teaching becomes associated with a kind of traditionalism or authenticity within that particular demographic of extraordinarily devoted enthusiasts who love this method. They love the way it makes them feel. And they wind up making up sort of excuses and rationalizations for why they're getting injured and why he seems to be hurting them. And then the understory of all of that is they begin to rationalize why he is actually sexually assaulting his female students basically every day of his career. So there's this very sneaky elision between him being perceived as a physical master who is able to reorganize the form of your body for spiritual insight, and him being somebody who's actually quite violent with his students to the point of assaulting and sexually assaulting the women in his class. And he does that for about 40 years. He gets away with it because nobody wants to confront him. There are some exceptions to that, but that is the sort of tragedy out of which this book unfolds.
I remember back in the late 90s and early 2000s, I had a number of fellow women teachers, yoga teachers, that were very much into Ashtanga yoga, that went to Mysore to study with him. And they would come back, and I was, of course, fascinated with what their experience was like. And they'd come back, and on the one hand, they were so moved by the experience they had. They clearly had a life-changing experience in a positive direction. But then they would also talk about some of the stuff that happened, and they would, like the 30-second hugs as a reward for doing a deep back bend or whatever. And I'd be like, that sounds pretty abusive to me. And this was, of course, before Me Too, and people weren't talking about it as much. But the excuse making, right. I'm like, if an American man did that to you that didn't have the name Guru, there would be a consequence to that, right? I think if most Indian men did that to you, that would be a consequence. But because he's this spiritual leader, you're making excuses, and it's hard. I could see that it was hard for them to reconcile the ick factor with the blissed out factor that they felt.
Right. You're raising so many good points at once, and I want to speak to all of them. There was a deep, I would say, cultural naivety and a kind of idealizing form of Orientalism, which is, the flip side of the dehumanizing form of Orientalism, which would sort of demonize people as being other or being, I don't know, naturally sexually criminal or something like that. But the idealized form of Orientalism kind of held Pattabhi Jois in this glow of, misperception, I would say. People thought that he was a philosopher. People thought that he was a tantric master. He had no training in any of those subjects. Now, this kind of idealization, this pedestaling, it was applied to Swami Vishnudevananda of Shivananda Yoga. It applied to Yogi Bhajan. It applied to Bikram Chaudhry. It applied to Swami Shivananda. I think for culturally sensitive people from colonizing cultures, when they wake up to their own kind of alienness within a place like India, there can be a tendency to overcompensate, to express a kind of deference out of a sense of deep cultural guilt, or maybe a sense of spiritual immiseration. Like, there's something so important going on here in India, I can't actually understand what it is, and all of these bad things must have a reason, and I'm being tested in some way. And that became like a primary refrain within the Ashtanga community, which was, oh, he's actually helping you find your points of inner conflict, right? He is helping you figure out, how you are sexually wounded so that you can get over it. He's giving you a safe space in which to blah, blah, blah. Additionally, we're also talking about people who, I don't know about your friends back in the day, but a lot of the people that I interviewed and read about and researched, I would say were kind of culturally marginal. They had separated out from their birth religions. They maybe had moved across the country. They weren't necessarily in great contact with their families. A lot of them were sort of post-late 60s dropouts still. A lot of them hadn't really found what to do through the 70s. They were kind of making it up as they went along. And in that sort of floating and groundless, identity of what do we do now? Like, what is supposed to be important? What they found in people like Pattabhi Jois was the image of a kind of domestic and patriarchal certainty that was very appealing to their own, perhaps, anxiety or their own inner conservatism. One of the things that happens in the literature around Jois is that, there's this book produced by Eddie Stern and Guy Donahay called Guruji, which is what they used to call Pattabhi Jois. And it's a series of maybe 30 interviews or something like that. It's 400 pages long. And I think the word father appears over 100 times in the book. He was like a father to me. He had such a father-like presence. He was he was like a loving father. I knew that I was safe with him. Well, they weren't safe with him. But
isn't that sort of like reflecting the words that a child that is abused by their father would say? There is a love there. It's my father. He may be beating me or sexually abusing me, but he's still my father. Yes. And there's an inherent conflict in that.
Yeah, so there's an initial idealization, and then there's a follow-up rationalization that follows along the lines of one of the researchers that I use in the book is Alexandra Stein, who describes how a kind of disorganized attachment style or pattern begins to emerge between the apparently loving and life-giving caregiver and their student or their child, when that life-giving caregiver is also terrifying in some way or is also harmful, and you don't know which one you're going to get. And so there can be a sense in which they fall in love with the fact that Pattabhi Jois has been married for 30 years and his wife makes him all of his food and he's doing arti every morning at 4:00 before he goes to the shala. And they can really sort of bond themselves to this vision of, I know that I'm now in an orderly place in the universe. It's not like Cleveland. And then secondarily, they can develop yes, he is a father to me because he both terrifies me, but I know that he loves me. And that's a very confusing situation to be in. And it gets replicated in high demand groups all the time.
I have a question for you, not just in terms of Pattabhi Jois, because I think I said this before we went on. He is well known for his misbehavior. I'm sugarcoating that significantly.
His crimes. Yeah,
his crimes. Yes.
Yeah.
Crimes, misbehavior, same thing. No, his misdeeds are well known and documented in your book. It certainly does a really good job to codify that. He's not even the worst of the gurus. I mean, if you've seen Wild Wild Country, you know what I'm talking about, the documentary series. I'm curious, though. I'll share my theory, and you can pick it apart if you'd like, or agree or disagree. I feel like there is a place for a guru, but where it looks something closer to like a psychotherapist here in the West, where there is a power differential, and that's not an inherently bad thing, but there is a code of conduct that is enforceable, because that's where I see the guru-disciple thing going completely off the rails. The behavior is important, and there's no feedback mechanism to say, no, you get to share yoga, you don't get to grope women. You know, you don't get to hit your students. You don't get to, bilk them out of their money or whatever the thing is, which holds the space for that. I'm your teacher and I can hold space for you while you go deeper into your practice and do your work.
Right.
But there's a standard that I'm held to. And
so
I'm not sure who enforces that.
Well, okay, who enforces it is a great question, because while I was writing this book, I also was a paid consultant with the Yoga Alliance while they went through their standards review process. Now, I think it sort of produced a middling result. I think there were some improvements, but at the beginning, I basically laid my cards on the table as part of the ethics committee, where I brought up the story of Manuso Manos from your part of the world, from the Bay Area, who
an Iyengar teacher
who people knew through an investigative report that was published in 1992.
I consulted on that one.
Oh, did you? Right.
Not 92. There was one more recent than that.
Yes. Much more recent. But back in 1992, the San Jose Mercury News published an investigative report that I only got a copy of because I happened to run into one of the women who had testified for that report, and she gave me a bloody photocopy. So it had been buried with regard to the outside world. The Iyengar world knew about it. He had been reinstated. It turns out, 30 years later, he most likely did not stop his behaviors. He was accused credibly by several people of ongoing sexual abuses. There was an internal investigation. It was covered by major media outlets. We did a whole bunch on it. And what I said to the committee at Yoga Alliance is, if you are not willing to consider regulating yoga teachers in the same way that psychotherapists are being regulated in various jurisdictions, with their code of conduct, with their colleges that can enforce some kind of withdrawal of licensure or penalties or so on, or re-education if the person needs it, or, they're banished, from practicing in the state altogether. If you're not willing to do that, what you're saying is that it's okay that Manuso Manos was able to offend in 1992 and not really be held to account by anybody except the colleagues that he most influenced, who let him back into the fold eventually. And that was the test. And I think everybody appreciated the logic of it. And also because Yoga Alliance is a very American, live free or die, hands off of my spiritual practice place. The bias was towards, well, yeah, we just really don't know how we are going to regulate all of these aspects of this spiritual practice that we can hardly even define. And I'm like, that's what psychotherapists said about psychotherapy. I've known people who said you can't regulate a conversation. Well, you did. They did. And so what you're bringing up is that in the yoga world, charisma, unfortunately, is too often the coin of the realm. And if a certain amount of social buzz gathers around somebody like Pattabhi Jois or Manusa Manos or Bikram Choudhury or Yogi Bhajan, they will be bulletproof from consequences. And that's just not true in regulated professions.
Well, I sort of get both sides of this, because the idea of the state stepping in and telling me what yoga should look like is not an appealing option to me.
Sure, that's
and
why
at the same time, like Yoga Alliance says I'm a bad yogi, and like, okay, it doesn't really have much of it to somebody who's got a large following. It doesn't really have.
It's not going to make
bite.
a dent, right? Yeah, and that's why the model, I think, ideally would be that a college emerges where the industry regulates itself in coordination with the government, and then goes to the government and says, we've figured out how to do this properly so that people don't get defrauded or hurt. But that's a long. I think the real sort of spiritual heart of that issue is that you started out by saying, I think there's room for some kind of leadership. And I would agree with you. And I would use the term mentorship, that like somebody who has been doing a thing and is familiar with not only the material, but also their limitations and they're transparent about that, that they can play a very powerful role in. I mean, I can't remember what year it was. It must have been like maybe, was it 2002 that I went and took this course with you in Costa Rica? And I don't know what your education was at the time. I can't recall what it was. But like, you had just been doing this thing for long enough to be able to say a few key things about relaxation, or the present moment, or the balance between effort and ease, or what it actually might mean to breathe deeply once in a while. It's not rocket science, but you also sort of
brilliant. Don't you?
Yeah, you are brilliant. Yeah, but I mean, like, you developed it over the 10 years or whatever, and that was good. And then there was no sense that I had. Coming out of these high demand groups, that you were doing anything more than a kind of, pretty well educated, but unregulated social service, really. That wasn't about gathering wealth and power, and you weren't. You were just a normal person. You weren't intrusive. It didn't seem like you needed praise from people.
I'm still waiting for you to grovel at my feet, dude.
I know.
Still waiting.
I know.
And if my goal was amassing wealth and power, I failed miserably.
Right. So that's all you got left is Matthew coming to San Francisco and touching your feet. Okay, I'll do it. Okay. I'll do it. I'll make you happy. I'll make you happy.
You could make a boy's wish come true. Right. You could make a wish foundation.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that when I did that training, that was one of my earliest trainings.
Yeah.
That was very much informed by. I always say this. Amrit Desai was one of my biggest teachers, and he was a fantastic yoga teacher. Like in how he taught yoga and philosophy and all of that. He was also morally bankrupt in a lot of ways. And it's another whole story it's for your next book. I know him to this day. And but the greatest thing he taught me, because my first teacher training was the week after he got booted out.
Wow. And so you went to Kripalu the week after he got booted out?
Yeah, I signed up. And then my mom's like, she found an article in the paper and it was about him getting the boot, and I'm like, oh shit. But I went there
Yeah.
expecting to be held by all these people that lived in this ashram, and they were just absolutely devastated. I mean, like, it was just utter emotional wreckage in the
Yeah.
wake of what happened. People were burning pictures of him and burning their mala beads, and
Yeah.
they were having, sharing circles where people were just wailing and crying. And I'm like, where am I? Like, I thought I was coming to learn how to teach yoga, but the truth is that taught me the importance of yoga teacher ethics. And like, wow, even as just like the yoga teacher at the Y who teaches this class, that's a lot of power to have.
Yeah.
Right? You're telling people what to do, you're potentially touching them.
Yeah.
And if you don't take that seriously, you're going to fuck people up.
I'm so happy to hear this story from you because I think it's so rich, and I think it bends around to some of the deeper questions around, like, okay, is all of this fucked up? Like, is there any goodness? Where's the goodness in it? And here's what I'll say about what I know about Amrit Desai. I went to interview him once, actually. I visited him in Florida, and like, okay, so I don't know. This is probably like 7 years ago, and I wanted to ask him, questions about how he formed his practice and what moving meditation was, and all of that stuff. And I was also going to ask him difficult questions about, like, okay, what happened back then, and how do you feel about it now, and how are you organizing your charisma this way? We didn't get that far with that, but what was amazing was that he was living in this sort of. It looked like a 1970s era castle that somebody had donated to him, and it was filled with crystals and mantras and altars and yantras and stuff like that. And I remember I came in the front door, and he was standing upstairs looking down, waiting for me to enter. Like, he knew when I was coming, and he was in his finest clothes. He was in like this beautiful bejeweled kurta, and he like very gracefully came down the steps, and I was like, wow, you are an amazing sort of combination of like extremely earnest. You want to present a very like a very welcoming and respectful sort of environment for me, and you're also working really, really hard to be this person. And I felt this empathy for him. Like, what is it like to grow up in an environment in which everybody thinks that you are so special like that? He had this kind of holy baby quality to him. And I think my sense is, maybe you can confirm this, is that what people were so enamored with was this childlike quality with which he unfolded his fluid postures, and how those directly related back to Swami Kripalvananda and this tender, intimate, very homosocial relationship that they had from the time he was a very young boy. And there was something so different about that to what came out of Mysore, what came out of Pattabhi Jois's world, what came out of the Iyengar world. Like, Swami Kripalvananda like created these incredibly fluid mudras with his body that had nothing to do with the modernist geometry and strength training and, no pain, no gain crap.
That's what
most
drew
of
me
us
to that lineage is the idea that it's not about getting it right. It's about using your will to clear the slate, so that I always tell people, like, when you see a dog doing downward dog, it's not thinking, are my paws the right distance? Are my hips high enough? It's doing what brings it joy, what the prana is moving it to do.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That's what we should be doing in yoga. Now, in the short term, I think we need discipline to unlearn some of the stuff we've learned in our body. But I am still friends with Amrit Desai to this day.
Yeah, right.
And I have talked to him about the scandal.
Yeah.
And I it's an interesting thing to hold two truths in my mind at the same time. That I really appreciate the way he taught me to teach yoga, the way he the way he defined yoga in the West in his way, which was different than Iyengar and Bikram and all these others. And yet that he hurt a lot of people.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people. I saw the aftermath of it.
And he hurt people in relation to the sphere of idealization around him as well, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't think he corrected anybody's impressions of him. In fact, he played them up. And then when it came to trying to fulfill them, he utterly couldn't. And he would go beyond that, and of course lie to people, and and womanize and destroy marriages and things like that. But like, there's something about the dynamism of that group where he gets centered as a kind of holy and sort of in I don't know. He can't be criticized, right? Like he's just too lovely. He's too full of peace.
Yeah. Well, the whole way his fall came out is one woman came forward and he said she was lying, she was crazy, she was obsessed with him. She was not.
Right.
She had to leave, and her son and husband stayed at the ashram, so she had to leave her son. They forced her out.
Yeah.
And then she got some therapy and came back and said, no, I'm not. It was like the first Me Too, like, call out that I can remember happening in my sphere of awareness.
Right.
And then other women came out, and that's when it all came toppling down. But no one believed this woman.
Yeah,
exactly. She was the crazy one.
Right. Yeah.
How dare you say something about him?
Yeah, and that comes directly from him and what was made of him, right? How can anybody speak against these images that have been created of our leader, and which he seems to endorse at every turn, and then perform, according to those promises. Wild story. But I do want to say that, like, whatever he was able, that single idea that the posture is not the thing that you do, but the posture is the thing that occurs when your body is free because you have somehow immersed yourself in the joy of the present moment. Like, that idea does not exist much, and it's extremely important, and I think it's very much related to something that is pre-modern, in fact, because when you read the medieval yoga literature, the postures are described pretty consistently in terms of these must be performed with gentleness because they will elicit particular responses, and then energy will be released, and that will take you over. So there's something very old about that. And Kripalvananda, who knows where he got it from? I think he was very intuitive. He was a theater guy, a musician, but like, I just think there's something very important there. And it's very tragic that combines with a personality, I think, that isn't able to really deal with it. People idealizing them can't deal with the transference, certainly can't deal with the countertransference because they don't have any training.
I want to finish with, I could talk to you for days about this. Either I need to come to Toronto for a visit, or you need to come to Berkeley for a visit, or both.
Right.
And we have to get our kids together too.
Yes.
But I'd like to broaden this just a little bit because of this. I think it's sort of like your thing. I mean, like with your podcast and your writing, some people I can imagine would attack you for attacking, or not. You're not even attacking. You're just saying the truth about what has happened and where some elements of the yoga / holistic health / new age community are toxic and mess up and full of crap and a scam. But I also believe that in doing that, that's how we reveal the truth, that there is some powerful stuff in there that's really good. And I'm wondering how we I think you're doing it, and I'm wondering if you have advice for people like me, yoga teachers, whoever, that need to be a little more fearless about calling out toxic crap when we see it, rather than just saying, "Oh, it's just Guruji."
Right. Well, I think some of the tide has turned around naming and really locating power abuse in spiritual communities. We are going through like a kind of golden age in cult documentaries and books and literature, and there's a new thing streaming every week, right? People are very, very aware, I think, and quite skeptical about the promises of alternative spirituality. And I think that's going to show up in the increasing sort of slide into economic irrelevance of the old models. The old ashrams, I don't think, are very long for the world. But in that context, I would say that you said you'll be attacked for telling the truth. Well, yes, you can be attacked for telling the truth because you violate people's deeply held expectations and their beliefs, and you also you can provoke moments of disillusionment that are very difficult to recover from. And I think there's a very important principle in yoga that I think should apply to truth telling, which is that I had a great Iyengar teacher called Kim Schwartz who would use props by saying, look, if you're going to take something away from somebody, you better make sure that they're supported in another way. If they need a block in Trikonasana and you want to encourage them to go a little bit farther, you make sure that they're stabilized in some other way. You can't simply black pill people with the crushing sort of truth of how devastating everything about their spiritual community was, because it's probably not exactly true. And it's not going to help them find the resources that they need to reconcile with their own experience and to figure out that not all communities are like that. And, in fact, their own life has not been wasted entirely, because that's never true. And so I want to direct people to a philosopher named Eve Sedgwick, who wrote an amazing paper in 1996 or 95 called Paranoid versus Reparative Reading. It's a little bit heady, but the basic idea is, as a truth teller, somebody who sees injustice clearly, you can get into a cynical mode, in which you are looking for every possible violation of power or hypocrisy or or bit of domination that disrupts a social organization. And good for you. It's great that you can do that. It's great that you can communicate about that. And I think you also can get to a point in which, like big thinkers like Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, who will see, injustice in everything, who will see problems everywhere, who will see demons under every couch. You can get into a mode of thinking where you miss what drew people into practice to begin with. You miss the good things that groups do, even if there is abuse within them. And that is a reparative mode. You look for things that are going well as much as you look for things that are going poorly, because it will help you understand both of those things better, actually. Because it's very easy to get wrapped up in the notion that the harm that a community commits is just sort of baked into the essence of it, and it's being promulgated by evil people who can't control themselves. It's usually more complex than that. So I think it's excellent to tell the truth. I think it's excellent also to be gentle with the people who can't quite see things the way you can. It's also really good to be gentle with your former self. I think it's really good to be gentle with people who want to stay at Kripalu even after this whole thing blows up and they want to rebuild something out of the ashes. Everybody's doing their best.
In my very first book on the Wizard of Oz as a spiritual metaphor, the wizard, it's sort of like Jungian archetypes. Each of the characters lives within us. And I see the wizard as being, I loosely refer to him as religion. And that could be a guru. It could be the Catholic Church. It could be anything. But where in the beginning, we need to believe something out there can get us home.
Yeah.
And so we go on this journey hoping that the wizard can help us. But the last step of that journey, and perhaps the most important, is to pull back the curtain and realize it's just a man. A flawed man, some good, some bad. But you sort of needed him to start your journey, to believe that there was something that worth seeking. You needed him to help find your own power and authenticity. But in the end, you got to pull back the curtain. And that's true whether you go to church or synagogue or mosque, to a guru, to Sri Darren Main's class.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Where all the curtains come back.
Yeah. Wait till I pull back mine. It's going to be a dumpster fire.
Yeah, that's a good place to end. I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, the hardcore atheist would say, well, we should never need wizards to begin with, but that's just not the way it happens. It's not the way
most people do.
Yeah, most people do. There are things that they need that lead them to places that then dissolve when they get there. And I think that's just the way it goes.
MatthewRemski.com is Matthew's website. I will, of course, put a link to that, as well as his newest book, which is Surviving Modern Yoga, which I think is going to be a must-read. I'm going to recommend any teachers I train read it because I think it's important. You can also check out the podcast he co-hosts, the Conspirituality Podcast, which delves into all sorts of topics like this.
Yeah.
And it's always a fun time. You're always either enlightening people or pissing them off, and maybe a little of both.
Yeah.
And it was just a joy to chat with you, Matthew. I've said this to you privately, but I'm going to say it here publicly. I'm really, really proud of you and the work you're doing. I think it's super important. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Darren. We'll definitely meet either here or in Berkeley sometime soon.
Excellent. I will also put links to all my stuff in the show notes, and I will see you in the next episode.